Hey there, it's John from Living the Music. Today we're talking about a classic hard rock band from the 70s and the early 80s, Rainbow, otherwise known as Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. Ritchie, of course, from Deep Purple fame, legendary guitarist. And what really has brought me onto this is because I recently read this book, this panel book by Martin Popoff, where he brings in all kinds of experts on Rainbow and music itself. And they go through every album, every song, kind of breaking it down lyrically, musically, what works, what doesn't work. So I've been a big Rainbow fan for a long time, and I thought I would share some thoughts here with you. Now, the questions I want to ask today are: what made Rainbow so good? Why are they still known and loved today? And secondarily, why were they maybe not as commercially successful as they could have been, and maybe even artistically successful as they really could have been, even though they did very well? So we're sort of asking what worked, what didn't work. Of course, it's all my opinion, but there you go. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and thank you for being here in any case. Now, one thing that works about Rainbow, let's just start with the obvious, is you've got Ritchie Blackmore. Now, as I say, that's the obvious of all time, but let's point it out and let's be clear. He is an excellent rock guitar player. He is legendary for a reason, because he has written some of the most all-time legendary, longest lasting, most well-known riffs of all time, including perhaps the greatest heavy rock riff called Smoke on the Water. Yeah, that's Ritchie Blackmore. And he's come up with many, many, many more than that, of course. Deep Purple during Ritchie's time is filled with classic tunes like Burn and Stormbringer and Space Truckin' and Mistreated and on and on. Even up to his 1984, sort of reunion with Deep Purple after he brought Rainbow to a close with Perfect Strangers. That title song has one of the riffs of the ages in there. So Ritchie is an incredible riff writer, different than a Tony Iommi. Perhaps Tony Iommi is the greatest heavy rock riff writer of all time, but Ritchie can hold his own, and he did it in his own distinctive way. But I think where Ritchie also shined is in his solos. I mean, my goodness, he brings that distinctive flair. You hear a solo by him and you just know it's him. It's got kind of like a classical influence to it. And at times he brings in Middle Eastern tones as well. But in any case, you just can tell it's him. It's kind of like with Carlos Santana or Tony Iommi, players like that, Eric Clapton. You just hear a few notes and you know that's who's playing the guitar. So Ritchie was absolute winner for this band. When he was going for a more adventurous kind of songwriting, he was game for that. When they wanted to go into more radio-friendly territory, he was game for that as well. And I would argue he did well in both of those. Perhaps a bit more successfully on the more adventurous rock stuff, but I think you got to give him credit for being able to make that transition at all, and to have some radio hits, some MTV hits, and even some top 40 hits in the early 80s. So Ritchie is a big part of the success that Rainbow had, no doubt. Of course, he is the driving force of the whole thing. Now, did he perhaps hold them back in ways also? Well, we'll get to that later. Now, the other thing about Rainbow that made them so successful was Ritchie's choice of singers. He chose really three excellent singers. Now, there's a Footnote album which came out in 1995, which we can also talk about a little bit. So really, he's had four singers. And if you count the live foray in the 2000s, he's actually had five singers, although that singer didn't put anything down in the studio. But for the main run of Rainbow, you had Ronnie James Dio for 3 studio albums and 1 live album. Now, Ronnie James Dio is another legend. He went on to great fame with Black Sabbath, doing what turned out to be 4 albums with them over the years. But in the 80s, he did, 2 albums with them and a classic live album also. And then he went on to form his own band, Dio, and he had quite a bit of success with them in the 80s also. So Ronnie James Dio is well known as one of the most powerful voices ever produced in heavy rock music. He's certainly my favorite heavy metal singer, and I loved him ever since I first heard him, probably on this album, the second Rainbow album, Rising. Now, we'll say a little bit more about Ronnie, but just to cap off the singers, after Ronnie left, Ritchie brought in Graham Bonnet. Now, Graham Bonnet is also an excellent, tremendous singer. Totally different from Ronnie, but, equally powerful in a sense. And that's really saying something. But Graham definitely is a very powerful singer. He came on for 1 studio album only. He does show up on subsequent releases of live material where he even does some of Ronnie's songs and does them quite well. He went on to work with Michael Schenker for an album, and then he formed his own group, Alcatraz, with Yngwie Malmsteen. So they had a little bit of success there. He's gone on to do a lot more Alcatraz. He's done solo albums. He's gone back with Michael Schenker. He's had, a long-standing career. Probably his commercial peak was with Ritchie, perhaps. I know he had some success early on in the UK, but in terms of worldwide popularity, I think the hit they had in 1979, the Russ Ballard song "Since You've Been Gone," was probably Graham's commercial peak, and that is a tremendous song. So Graham, that even though it's for 1 album, he really, made a name for himself, and really is a legendary part of this group just because of that incredible contribution. And that whole album, Down to Earth, is still quite a good album. It still has Cozy Powell on drums, which we'll talk about in a moment, and it's still pretty heavy, although it's leaning more toward the commercial side. After Graham left, Ritchie brings in Joe Lynn Turner. Joe is East Coast guy, but he is a great singer also. I think he's a little bit, his voice sounds a little bit like Brad Delp from Boston to me, a little bit on the side of Lou Gramm. I don't know if he's quite as absolutely world-class, top of the top as those two, but he's either right there or maybe just a bit under, but I love Joe's voice. He does 3 studio albums with Ritchie that are more on the commercial side. They're still rocking a lot of times, but it's kind of toning down the experimental nature of the first few albums. So any way you slice it, he really he did well on his choice of singers. Love those 3. The guy in 95, Doogie White, is also quite good. So no problem there. It's just that album in and of itself doesn't blow me away, but we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So you got Ritchie Blackmore, you got these great singers, starting with Ronnie James Dio. That's a great start to a band. Now also, I mentioned Cozy Powell. He's one of my favorite drummers of all time. I love him in Rainbow. So he does Rising, the second album. He does Long Live Rock and Roll. The third studio album, he does On Stage, the live album. And he does Down to Earth, the Graham Bonnet album. He leaves after that, but in any case, Those albums are fantastic. He really shines on the live album. I love his booming playing. He's very along the school of Bonham from Zepp, and but he does it his own way, and I just love his powerful fills. I mean, we'll come to Rising here in a moment, but you know the fills he does on the second side of this album are just of an incredible, powerful, intricate nature. I mean, just perfect for the songs, but very showy as well. I dig it. I love Cozy Powell. Ritchie also filled out the band with great keyboard players, great bass players. Now he's changing those guys up a lot, so I'm not going to really get into specifics, but he always has great musicians working with him. By the time of that 95 album, I'm sure those guys are great musicians, but some of the personality of the individuals seems to be subdued, except for Ritchie's playing. It just doesn't have the idiosyncrasy of the other albums where guys seem to have the space to show their talent. He kind of wanted a more constricted sound, I think, for that last album, but still, they're great players. So the musicianship is fantastic throughout. Now, the songwriting, I'm going to say it's definitely of a high quality. Ronnie and Ritchie are a great songwriting team. Ritchie was kind of getting tired of the funk approach or leanings of Deep Purple. He wanted to get into more basic rock and roll. So they do this first album that's kind of straight ahead in some places, but then it gets into the kind of medieval side of things that Ronnie loved to write about, with 16th century green sleeves and Man on the Silver Mountain, things like that. But on this album, Ronnie brought over his backing band from his previous band before he joined Rainbow, Elf. They're great musicians too, but I don't love it as much as the Cozy Powell era in terms of just like the sound of the arrangements and the way the band comes together. Ritchie's playing is spectacular, no doubt. But back to the songwriting. Ronnie and Ritchie are a legendary combination, especially when you get to Rising and Long Live Rock and Roll. There's certainly a handful of songs between those albums that are among, I would say, really the best that hard rock has ever produced. I know that's saying a lot, but when you talk about songs like Stargazer, A Light in the Black, Gates of Babylon, Lady of the Lake, these are really standout tunes that have stood the test of time, and really not much, if anything, has topped them in subsequent years. Now, with the Down to Earth album, Graham doesn't actually do the lyric writing, so he's brought in Roger Glover from Deep Purple to do bass and producing, and then Roger, I think, writes the lyrics also. So you got Russ Ballard on here too, but the lyrics aren't as noteworthy on these albums going forward. But they're fine, they're serviceable. They start getting into love songs, breakup songs and this and that, and, relationship problem songs and all of that. And then when you get into the Joe Lynn Turner era, Joe eventually starts writing lyrics with, for Ritchie, and he does a fine job. Roger still does some of it also. But the Roger, Joe Lynn Turner, Ritchie combination, I think, works quite well. In this era of Difficult to Cure, Straight Between the Eyes, and Bent Out of Shape, you got a lot of really good songs in there. Verging on pop songs. I mean, some of them are straight up pop songs. Others of them are simply good rock songs. The lyrics, as I say, aren't quite as noteworthy as with Ronnie James Dio, but that could just be my taste as well. I love Ronnie's writing, and I love all that Dungeons and Dragons and Sorcerers stuff that he came up with, among whatever he did, he seemed to bring a certain intelligence and wit to it that I loved. But I mean, he's a very high bar. So that's not to say the writing's really like terrible on these Joe Lynn Turner albums. It's still of a high quality. And with a couple of those songs, I think they really knocked it out of the park commercially, like Stone Cold and Street of Dreams. Those are excellent tunes, and they really should have been more successful than they were. They may have been top 40 or bubbling around there in the US, but to my ears, they're every bit as good as stuff Foreigner was coming out with at the time, which were much more successful for whatever reason. So that's something we can look at in a moment also when we start thinking about maybe what didn't work for the band. But look, listen to those songs. I mean, and then, you know, there's great rockers on there like Spotlight Kid from Difficult to Cure that opens this album. That's a tremendous song. That's one of my favorite Rainbow songs of all time. So generally speaking, quite good songwriting. Another thing is they were a great live band. They were always a great live band. You got Ritchie Blackmore, and you know, now he could be a volatile personality, but even if he's not, you know, in a happy mood, I think he's still going to put on a great show. I happened to finally be able to see them on the 95 tour, which wasn't them at their absolute peak, but still I was excited to see them in the Bay Area. We went to a club show, actually. I don't know how many were there, maybe 1,000, 1,500 or so. And it was an awesome show. You know, now the thing I remember though is they had an opening band that may have come on around 8:15. They probably finished around 9. Ritchie and the boys didn't come on for their set until 11 o'clock. I mean, we were just waiting and waiting and waiting. It's probably like the longest I ever had to wait for an artist to come on. Like, by the time that show was over, I was just like exhausted. But still, I can say I went to a Rainbow show. I saw Ritchie Blackmore live. So, you know, it was all worth it looking back on it. Okay. Now, what maybe got in the way of Rainbow's greater success that was in their potential but was unrealized ultimately? Well, you kind of get the idea, at least, you know, somewhat from what I've said so far, in that they change lineups so often. They're changing personnel here, there, and everywhere. Every album has some changes on it. Now, you had some continuity with those 3 albums with Ronnie, and then by the time you get to Joe, you get 3 albums with him too. So that has some, you know, temporary continuity, if you will. But if you look at the you know, the brand name and the whole span of that time from say 75 until 83, they're going through a lot of different changes. You go from Ronnie James Dio to Graham Bonnet to Joe Lynn Turner. That's probably throwing off the radio people and even the general public, kind of like, what is this? What's going on? Now, of course, if you're Ritchie, you started this band. This is your namesake. This is your baby. You don't want to change the name every time you bring in a new singer. I get it, but still, by keeping the name the same and changing the personnel and changing the sound, that also had a bit of a detrimental effect, I believe. If he would have stayed with Ronnie, perhaps with their touring, they could have gone on to greater and greater success, keeping up that adventurous approach, maybe dipping a little bit into radio-friendly songs. Even Dio, who, you know, kind of shits on Ritchie's commercial era, he had a commercial side too, with songs like Rainbow in the Dark and Mystery early on in his solo career. So maybe he would have been game for some of that as time went on, but I think they had personality differences, and at least initially, Ronnie didn't want to hear anything about being more radio friendly. So unfortunately, that blew up. what would have happened if he would have stayed with Joe? Now that's interesting, and I think they again could have had sustainable success as time went on. He decided instead to go back to Deep Purple and kind of go back to that well. They did very well with their first album back in '84, Perfect Strangers, but still, again, it's leapfrogging here, there, and everywhere. What if he just would have maintained Rainbow and worked with Roger and Joe and just kind of kept honing that hard rock but also commercial sound, again, along the lines of a Boston and a Foreigner and that type of thing. So I would say the lineup changes hurt to some extent. Secondly, I think Ritchie's personality to some extent got in the way. Ronnie always, he sometimes would talk about how Ritchie was a little bit not so fan friendly, if you will. Ronnie was always making a point of, we gotta go do encores, you gotta be there for the fans. He wants to meet the fans after the gig and connect and all of this. And there were times when Ritchie would just say, we're not doing an encore tonight. And Ronnie would be like, why not? And Ritchie said, they don't deserve it, meaning the crowd. So, that you just sort of can't take that away from Ritchie, because that irascible nature is also probably what made his guitar playing so aggressive and so cool. But that kind of insular nature, I think, might have gone against him too. He came across as a bit of an aloof figure. Again, that has some mystery to it, but at the same time, if you want to be a quote unquote pop star, you kind of have to play the game and be fan friendly and get out there and do tons of interviews and all that kind of stuff. So I would say maybe parts of his personality got in the way. And lastly, let's come back to the songwriting, because although the songwriting was excellent in many cases, it perhaps wasn't quite up to snuff in all cases. Now, of course, it's very difficult to make a 10 out of 10 album in any time and for anybody. But when you look at these Rainbow albums, they are a little bit patchy, beginning with the first one. And although I love Rising, I'm not a huge fan of Do You Close Your Eyes or whatever that is. It's okay. Starstruck is pretty fun, but let me just check that title real quick. Do You Close Your Eyes? Yeah. It's got a hook to it. It's not terrible, but it's not necessarily in the style of the rest of the album. And even the song Starstruck is a little bit jarring, because it's not like Tara Woman and Run with the Wolf and Stargazer and Light in the Black. But still, they pretty much pulled off a classic with this one. Long Live Rock and Roll. Again, you got a couple of semi-clunkers on here. The Shed. That's a pounding tune, but it's not the greatest writing. Certainly not lyric writing. You got LA Connection is okay. Rainbow Eyes is a nice ballad, but it doesn't really have a lot of dynamics to it at the same time. So, it's not the greatest ballad of all time by any means. The Down to Earth album, it's good tunes, but it's just not hitting on all cylinders. I love most of it, but I tell you, a lot of times I listen to this, I don't end up remembering the tunes. They don't stick with me as much, and I've heard that from other people as well. So maybe the hooks were a little bit lacking here. And then with the Joe Lynn Turner albums, it's kind of half and half in terms of where it works, in terms of the songwriting, and the other half where it's not terrible, but it's could be just not as hooky as it needs to be, or the lyrics can be even embarrassing at times. This is the only one I have on CD, by the way. I need to get Straight Between the Eyes and Bent Out of Shape. I do like those albums for the most part, but yeah, so I'm claiming the songwriting was great at times and average at other times. Every once in a while, it could veer into poor. And I think, yeah, that held them back a little bit. Now, overall, I still think they're one of the greatest, classic bands of their time. And they should have been more successful despite everything I just said as a potential knock against them, or just trying to look for explanations of how they could have even been better. Even as I say all of that, I think they should have had more success. The Ronnie era should have sold more. The Joe era should have done better. I mean, Street of Dreams is a fantastic pop song. I'll just note that one in particular. Stone Cold is really their biggest hit, but I love Street of Dreams, and the video for that was great. I cannot understand why that didn't do better. It's like record company perhaps, or just the particular month it came out, or they weren't, giving the radio stations enough of this or enough of that. Who knows what got in the way, but I think it's kind of, bullshit, because it deserved to do better. Now, the best of Rainbow is not just high quality. It's of the highest quality that you could expect in this kind of music. So, like I said, Spotlight Kid from this album, Difficult to Cure, fantastic. Go listen to Spotlight Kid. You'll be hard pressed to get it out of your head once it gets in there. It's so catchy. I love it. Since You've Been Gone, the big hit on here, love that. Earworm. Gates of Babylon, Kill the King on here, probably my favorites. Lady of the Lake also. I'll come back to this. Man on the Silver Mountain, 16th Century Greensleeves, my favorites on here. Love those. Catch the Rainbow. Now that is a really good ballad on this one. Still I'm Sad's a great instrumental. He does do some interesting instrumentals, especially in the Joe Lynn Turner era, that I do love. Very tasteful. Very, very well done. But back to this album. Stargazer, A Light in the Black. So that's on side B. You got these two epic tracks, one after the other. Stargazer is well known as the absolute standout of standouts, one of the greatest songs ever written. And yeah, it's got excellent storyline, excellent lyrics, great vocal performance, great drum performance, great keyboards, everything's fantastic. But then even the solo is composed in this. Maybe he's doing some spontaneous riffing here or there, but as you listen to the solo from point A to point Z, you can tell there's been some thought put into this, and even the way the whole band comes along with him, it's well thought out and just absolutely perfectly put together, perfectly composed and perfectly performed. Cannot say enough good things about Stargazer. That will stay with you forever if you give that one a chance. So that's pretty much summing up my thoughts on Rainbow. I will love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What's the best of Rainbow to you? What do you think was fantastic about them? What do you remember about them? Did you get to see them live? Give us any thoughts on Ritchie and Rainbow. And again, you got these books if you want to do some research and kind of relive those days. Either one of these is good. Get them both if you can. He did put out this album, Final Vinyl, which is pretty cool. It's got some live tracks on here. It's got a couple of studio tracks that weren't on the albums, which is nice. So this is worth getting as well. And then I need to get the final album, Stranger in Us All. I have listened to that, and I like quite a bit, about half the tunes. The other half are sort of forgettable to me. I'll keep listening because I'm you know, if it's Ritchie, it probably has some good quality stuff on it. But as I said before, I think it's a little bit mechanical in the playing from the rest of the guys, and it's just kind of showcases Ritchie, which is great, but it just doesn't have the personality from the other incarnations of the band. All right. Thanks for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Take care till then. Listen to some Rainbow.